Before we get started, we just wanted to let you know that this video has been created from an internal session that we have used to publish externally, so everyone can benefit from the amazing content shared. Enjoy Jared's fantastic and detailed talk on the Azure Landing Zone accelerators.
I'm Jared Holgate. I'm a cloud solution architect in the customer architecture and engineering team, which is the same team that Jack's in. We're responsible for the infrastructure as code and the portal experience for Azure Landing Zones. And we also are responsible for Azure verified modules, which some of you might be aware of. One of my roles within the team is the tech lead on the Azure Landing Zone accelerators, which is what we're sharing today. And they're designed to help deploying the platform landing zone. And I'm going to talk to that today and let you know how that works. Okay, so yeah, what we're going to cover today, we're going to cover a bit of background. What is a landing zone? Why did we create the accelerators? What are they and how do they work? A demo, and then we're going to talk about what's on the roadmap and how you can get involved as well. Okay, so hopefully you can just about see this. I don't see it in full screen on my view, so hopefully you can. So there's two types of landing zone that we talk about in Azure Landing Zones. There's a platform landing zone and an application landing zone. So the focus of what we're going to talk about and demo today is the platform landing zone. So that's the management groups and policies. And it's also the connectivity subscription, the management subscription, and the resources inside the management subscription. And it's also the identity subscription. I've done that in a slightly different color because we don't actually deploy things like Azure Enter ID domain services or Active Directory controllers. We don't deploy that part for you, but it's part of the platform landing zone, so you can see that there. So the bits that we do deploy are in purple here. And then moving on to the blue part, this is the application landing zones. This is subscription vending workloads that you actually want to deploy into that landing zone. So things like peering the virtual networks and whatever resources you want to deploy for your actual application to be effective. That's what goes in the application landing zone. So yeah, today the focus is on platform landing zone, but we are going to touch on application landing zone later on as well. You can learn more about what an Azure landing zone is here, by the way, if you go through to this link. So what did we have before the accelerator? So we had a couple of things already. So we had the portal, which is basically our ClickOps approach to deploying an Azure landing zone. So it's fire and forget. So you deploy it once, and then it's not very easy to update it post that. So we introduced the infrastructure as code modules for Bicep and Terraform. So these modules will deploy what we talked about in the previous slide in terms of the platform landing zone. So the management groups, the policies, some role definitions, and some management resources as well are deployed with these modules. And you can then manage the landing zone over its lifetime, so you can make updates to it. You can add, when we introduce new policies, you can apply those new policies to it. Any new features that we add to it, you can apply those new features because it's using infrastructure as code. So you can update it and maintain it over its lifetime. So internally at Microsoft, we have a concept of a value-based delivery, which is basically a delivery used to help our customers. So we had a bunch of manual steps effectively that we used to help our customers to deliver this landing zone. And we were able to do that, but it didn't do much with regards to the day-to operation. So how do they keep the landing zone up to date? How do they apply new policies to that landing zone? We didn't provide much guidance around that. So that's why we started looking at the accelerators. So just a bit more in depth on the reasons why. I'm not going to read through all these, but essentially there was a lack of ability for us as Microsoft to help our customers with those day-to operations. And we say best practices like continuous integration, continuous delivery. This is how you should manage your infrastructure as code. But then we didn't tell them how to do that. And it was either we can't help, or it's a custom engagement with somebody that happens to have that expertise, which could be few and far between. So there was a gap there in terms of our ability to help customers. As partners, like the modules are great, the infrastructure as code modules, but how does a partner implement the best practices of continuous delivery to help their customers? In many cases, the partner had to invent their own automation and their own pipelines and templates to wrap around our infrastructure as code modules. There wasn't something that we could provide to help partners there. So again, that was another reason for looking at that. And then a customer might be very new to infrastructure as code, might not know, have much experience of infrastructure as code, but might know that that's the best practice that they want to implement. But just looking at our modules, ISE modules, it's not like an easy onboarding ramp for somebody that's never touched infrastructure as code before. So the accelerator was something that came along to help with that, right? A customer that doesn't necessarily have in-depth infrastructure as code experience is able to use the accelerators to still use infrastructure as code and best practices without necessarily needing upfront in-depth knowledge of infrastructure as code and continuous delivery practices. So those were some of the reasons that we looked at developing the accelerator. So and just a bit more like what is it? Why did we create it? So it's an opinionated approach to using those Azure Landing Zone infrastructure as code modules. So what do we mean by opinionated? It means it's one way of doing it. It's a way that we think is a good way of doing it. It's a starting point for customers, right? We're not going to cover every single use case for every single customer, but we're giving them a starting point and then they can evolve it from there. We're doing the bootstrapping, the hooking up of everything for them, and then they can add their own configuration or extend the modules as they see fit, depending on what they need to do. So leading on from that, it's also an opinionated approach to bootstrapping, continuous integration, and continuous delivery for that platform landing zone. So configuring the version control system, the continuous delivery pipelines, the identity, the state management, if it's Terraform. We're providing an approach to do that, an opinionated approach based on our experience. But again, it might not suit every single customer and every single use case, but it's for many customers, it'll be a good approach for them to use. So we wanted to, in terms of what we were talking about before, we wanted to leave the customers in a better position to be able to maintain their landing zone moving forwards. So whereas before we might have delivered the ISE module and deployed it from a local PC, like a laptop, and then left it with the customer to decide what they want to do with that state file that they've got on their local machine, and that Terraform or bicep code that sat on their local machine, right? What do I do with this? How do I hook up to my continuous delivery or my version control system? We wanted to leave the customer in a better position where that module and that state file was already in a good place at the end of it. And then we wanted to reuse some of the experience that we've had from many customer deployments. WAF aligned best practices in terms of how we do identity and security around the pipeline and the agents and everything else. So that was the other bit that we wanted to include there. So what is it? How does it work? So there's three main components to it. So the first one is a PowerShell module, which is available in the PowerShell gallery. It's just called ALZ. That PowerShell module is cross-platform, so it's PowerShell core, so it'll work on Linux, Windows, or Mac OS. And then coupled to that, there's a bootstrap module. So the bootstrap modules are Terraform modules. So whether you're using Bicep or Terraform, these are Terraform modules. And the reason we use Terraform for this part is because Terraform has the ability to deploy things to GitHub and Azure DevOps, which Bicep currently doesn't have, right? So we use Terraform as a convenience for that. This doesn't actually impact the end product, right? Because this is like a bootstrapping exercise. So whether we used Terraform, PowerShell, or bash scripting, it doesn't matter, right? But we chose to use Terraform for this because it's something that we've got experience of, and it gives us the ability to provide updates as well in the future. And the last part is the actual starter modules themselves. So by starter module, we mean some code that we're going to put in your version control system repository for you. And that, in this case, that's going to be the platform landing zone IAC module and its configuration. So we've got those for Bicep and we've got those for Terraform. And basically they'll get looped into the bootstrap and configured end to end for you, ready to go. The fourth component, which isn't really covered in this diagram, is the documentation. So in this repository for the Azure PowerShell module, we've got some comprehensive documentation that takes you through step by step, input by input, how it works. So you can follow that through. So at a high level, what does the bootstrap deploy? So there's two parts to what the bootstrap deploys. So there's some things that go into Microsoft Azure and some things that go into your version control system. At the moment, we support Azure DevOps or GitHub for the version control system, but we also provide a third option, which is the local file system. So you can actually output everything that we show here, well, not the configuration of the version control system, but like the other bits. You can deploy this bit and then you can spit out the module with a script ready to go. So that's the third option, and you can take that, either deploy it immediately as the landing zone, or you can take that and put it into your third-party version control system, one that we don't currently support. So at a high level, we deploy identities. This is for both Bicep and Terraform, so we have a separate plan and apply, or in the case of Bicep, it's a what if stroke deployment identity. So one is read-only, one is read-write on the relevant subscriptions. For Terraform, we've got a state file, and we've got some private networking. For both Bicep and Terraform, we have a container registry and currently some container instances. In the future, we're going to support Azure container apps and managed DevOps pools, if you're familiar with that as well. There's different options for these agents. At the moment, it's just container instances. In the version control system, we bootstrap the repository. This is where the starter module files go that I was referring to before. Got things like branch policies on here. We've got environments. We've got teams or groups that we create for approvals, and that the approvals are for the apply stage. We've also got the CI and CD pipelines or actions, depending on whether you're using GitHub or Azure DevOps. And then in Azure DevOps, we've got service connections, which you might be familiar with. And then we've got the agent pool or runner group, depending on which using. So we hook up everything end to end, ready to go. So at a high level, the accelerator works in a three-phase process. So this is the bit I was just talking about on the previous slide. So this is what we actually we have the PowerShell module, and we have the Bootstrap modules, and then we've got the starter modules, and they run as part of the second phase here. So the first phase is we do have some prerequisites. So there are some potentially manual steps that you need to follow. So you need an elevated account to begin with to run the Bootstrap. And so we talk about how you can create that either using a user account or a service principal. And then you need some subscriptions. You need an identity, a management, and a connectivity subscription. If you're familiar with Azure Landing Zones, they'll be familiar to you, and I showed them on that diagram earlier. So once you've got those prerequisites in, so there's steps in our documentation to talk you through this. Then we run the Bootstrap. So basically, we run the PowerShell module with some configuration. I'll go into a bit more depth on that shortly. And that'll then run that Bootstrap and deploy those resources that we saw on the previous slide. Once that's done, it's going to hook up everything end to end, right? So there's no manual steps between phase 2 and phase 3. The only thing you have to do in phase 3 is go into your version control system, Azure DevOps or GitHub, and just trigger the pipeline, so the continuous delivery pipeline, and then that will deploy your landing zone for you immediately. So everything's hooked up, ready to go. Okay. So this is just a bit of a deeper dive into each of those steps. Just checking on time whether I'll go through this in much more depth. I'll probably move on to the demo, but basically I've kind of touched on this already. There's some steps at a high level that you'll follow which are documented. So you'll need to get one of our input configuration files, which I'll show you in a second. There's some choices that you have to make, right? So you need to choose whether you want to use Bicep or Terraform. You need to choose which version control system you're using. So either Azure DevOps, GitHub, or the local file system if you want to use a third party, or you've got no version control system. And then you need to choose the starter module. So we've got several starter modules. For Bicep, we've got one at the moment. For Terraform, we've got some different ones. So we've got the one that I'm going to show you, complete multi-region. Then we've got sovereign landing zones, and we've got others that will be coming as well. And then you need to make some choices around your networking. So you can choose from 3 high-level options for the agents and runners that you're deploying. So you can choose whether to use self-hosted agents with private networking. You can choose self-hosted agents with public networking, or you can choose to use Microsoft-hosted agents. So the same 3 apply for whether you're using Azure DevOps or GitHub. You can choose those 3 options. You need to fill out the optional inputs in the input files. You need to create a folder to store the artifacts and the state file for the bootstrapping. And then you need to install the module. You need to run the module, basically. And then the third phase, as I mentioned before, you just go into your version control system and trigger the pipeline. Or if it's the local file system, we actually spit out for Bicep and Terraform, we spit out a PowerShell script. And that PowerShell script is configured such that you can run it immediately and it will deploy the landing zone for you. And then you just have to wait for that landing zone to be deployed, basically. So what do the input files look like? So we used to support a UI option, and we don't support that anymore because we need to support complex data types and things like that now. So the only way to supply the inputs for the accelerator are via these input files. So these can be in JSON or YAML. These are the standard inputs. So pretty much every option you choose from will have these standard inputs. So you're choosing the type of IAC, which we touched on the last slide, choosing your version control system, you're choosing which starter module it is. So that's those basic inputs up there. And then there's some that are more specific to what you're deploying. So if you're deploying in a multi-region, the starter locations, you would need to choose 2 or more regions. So for Terraform, we support N regions. You can deploy to however many you want. There might be time constraints on that, on how long it takes, but you can essentially deploy to as many regions as you want. With Bicep, we currently support 2 regions, but that should change when we move to the AVM modules for Bicep later. The management group ID here, you can, if you just leave it empty, it'll go to 10 root group, but you can specify an intermediate management group that you want to deploy your management group structure under there as well. The subscription IDs, the subscriptions we mentioned earlier. So those are the 3 subscriptions, so you need to supply those IDs. You can deploy to a single subscription if you want to. We don't recommend it, but it is possible to do it through this. So there's some other things that you need. So depending on whether you've chosen Azure DevOps, GitHub, or the local file system, you'll have to put different inputs here. But we need some things like we need some access tokens for the version control system, which any of the inputs here can be supplied through environment variables as well. So you don't have to hard code, like I've got in this example here, you don't have to hard code the personal access tokens. You can supply them through environment variables. And like any of these can be supplied through environment variables. So it's not just the sensitive ones. If you don't want to store your organization name, for example, you could do that too. We have a 3 or a 4 subscription model for this. So generally people just have 3 subscriptions, and the bootstrap resources that I talked about before, so the state file and the identities and the storage account would probably go into the management subscription, but you can choose if you wanted to have a 4th subscription that you deploy those resources into, so they're completely separate to your landing zone. And then it offers an extra layer of security potentially that they're in a separate subscription, which isn't intermingled with your management resources. So I'm not going to go too much into much more depth on each of these individual things, given how much time we've got. So I'm going to skip on to the demo next, I think. So this just quickly to explain what this is. So with our complete multi-region module, you can we allow you to specify that the Azure Landing Zone configuration in granular detail. So you can choose the names of everything, you can choose your IP address ranges and things like that. So we provide this example out of the box, so you don't have to figure it all out yourself from scratch, right? We provide this example and then you can just change it to your particular needs. And another thing about the input files is that you can use as many input files as you want, right? You can break up those variables into separate files and supply multiple files. It doesn't all have to be in one big file, so which might make it easier to manage. Okay, I'll move on. Okay, so yeah, this is where everything's likely to go wrong, but let's give it a shot anyway. So I did try recording this earlier and I just ran out of time, so I'm just going to go for it and see how we get on. So hopefully you can see a screen with a green field there. So I'm going to show you first of all that we've got some an example of some input files here. So what I'm going to deploy in this demo is I'm going to use Terraform and Azure DevOps, and I'm going to use the multi-region landing zone we're going to deploy that as well. So you can see here I've filled out those things. I'm using environment variables, so I don't have to share my secrets on the screen here. So I'm supplying these via environment variables. And then I'm going to actually deploy virtual WAN. So you can choose between hub and spoke virtual networks, or you can choose virtual WAN. So we've got examples of both. So you can see here I've got the configuration for virtual WAN. So this is the out of the box example. I've just copied and pasted it. So you can see here we've got a primary region and a secondary region. The other thing worth noting in here is that we've got these template variables. So rather than having to hard code UK South or UK West or whatever regions you might want, you can use these templates and take the ones that were passed in as inputs in the previous input file. So where we've got UK South and UK West here, they're mapped to starter location 1 and starter location 2, basically. So you can use them in naming, or you can actually use them as the location of your resource, right? We've got some other ones that we have in here as well. So availability zones, we get those dynamically for you and then pass them into this variable, so you don't have to figure out that UK West has got no availability zones and UK South has got 3. We figure that out for you, and then you can just use this variable to set it wherever you need them. So I think that was all I was going to show you there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off the deployment, because it might take a little bit of time, and we can go from there. So the first thing you need to do is install the module, which I might already have installed here. So okay, and then I'm just going to copy this line here. So I'll explain what this is before I run it. Okay, so in this PowerShell module, there's a function called deploy accelerator. So this is the only function that you use with the accelerator. And this has got an input called inputs, which takes an array of input files. So in this case, we've got 2 input files. So the 2 that I just showed you, the Azure DevOps YAML and the virtual WAN. So these are the 2 that we're passing in here. So I'm just using an absolute path in this case to pass those in. So I'm just going to run that. So in my input file, one thing that I missed was I've told it where my output folder path is. So this path here is where it stores the intermediate files that it's going to use for the bootstrap. So if I go into my file explorer, this is that folder basically. So Accelerator, Output, Terraform, Azure DevOps. So you can see it's downloading the releases into these folders here, and it's running that script. So it's already finished doing the accelerator part, and now it's running a Terraform plan, which is the first stage after it's done the configuration. So if we just dig into here, I can show you what it's done in that first stage. So basically, it's copied the code down and it's generated this TFVARS JSON file. So in this TFVARS JSON file, it's got basically what I said in my inputs that I wanted. So it's got a whole bunch of information here, but it's also got the inputs that I sent in there as well. And the same for the starter module. So if I just go back to the starter module, I chose complete multi-region, which is this one, and then I've got a TFVARS JSON file. So this one is actually going to get pushed up to source control. So again, this has got all that information that I told it about my hub and spoke networking. That's all in here, so it knows what it's going to deploy. And you can see here one of the variables is that I want to use virtual WAN in this case. So if we just go back here, so it's finished doing the plan now. You can look at the plan if you want to and see exactly what it's going to deploy. I'm not going to go through that in depth now, so I'm just going to hit enter, which is the default to continue and actually deploy this. So I'm going to show you some bits whilst we're waiting for that to deploy. So I'm going to get my Azure portal over. Okay, well, first of all, I'm going to show you the docs, right? So these are the docs I was talking about. So you can see we've got a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 here. So phase 1 is showing you, telling you about the tools that you need. It's telling you about the Azure subscription, so the free subscriptions I mentioned, management, identity, and connectivity. It also tells you about the authentication to Azure, what you need to set up for that. If you want to use a service principal, we've got a link to take you through to another page that shows you how to configure that. And then depending on which version control system you're using, we've got some details about what you need to configure there. So it tells you like least privilege permissions that you need on a personal access token in this case. And the same for GitHub, we show you the least principal privileges that you need for that personal access token. So once you've set up those prereqs, then you're on to phase 2. So phase 2, it tells you to install the module like we just did. And it explains how you can update the module as well. And then depending on whether you've chosen Azure DevOps, GitHub, or local file system, you can click through to the relevant section. So we chose Azure DevOps. This is the bicep instructions here. I'm just going to scroll down to Terraform to quickly show you. So the Terraform instructions are here. There's links through to the relevant the YAML file examples. So if I just click on this one here, this is the one that we just used. So I basically copied that and pasted this, and then I just replaced the placeholders here. And then for each of those inputs, there's a description of what they are, what the placeholders are, and what have you in here. So there's information about all of those inputs there. Many of them you'll just leave as the default. You won't need to change them, but we document them all anyway. And then we provide some in-depth documentation on each of the modules themselves. So for the complete multi-region module, we've got some documentation here about what each of the inputs are and where you can find out more information about each of those inputs as well. So that's the documentation there. Phase 3 just basically tells you to go into Azure DevOps and run the pipeline. And same for GitHub. And then in the local file system, we tell you where to go to run the script, basically. So phase 3 is relatively straightforward because everything's happened in the bootstrap. So I'm just going to show you one that sorry, the thing's just in the way, just 1 second. Okay, so whilst I was setting this up today, I actually ran it for GitHub. So although we're running Azure DevOps at the moment, I set up a GitHub one earlier and actually ran the platform landing zone deployment. So you can see here that this was the pipeline that ran and finished that. You can also see that it took 1 hour and 48 minutes. So just to forewarn you that sometimes it can take time depending on how Azure's performing on that day. But basically in GitHub, we've got some settings I want to show you. So this is the starter module that it put up for me. So it created this repository and it put all the files in it for me. It also configured some things for me. So in branches, I've got a branch protection rule here, which requires pull request for PRs. It's also set me up an environment, two environments in this case. So one for plan, one for apply. And if I look inside here, you can see that it's set up a required reviewers, a team that I need to use to approve that. So if I go into my org, you can see that there's a team here called this one, the approvers one, and it's just got me in it because I only specified me in that configuration file, but you can have many people or nested teams and things like that. And then we've just got one environment variable here, which is the client ID of our user assigned managed identity, which I'll touch on in a second. So we actually have two repositories that get deployed. So there's the GitHub one that I showed you, and then we've got a GitHub templates one. The reason that we have this template repository is so that we can specify the template and add a bit of extra security. So with OpenID Connect, you can specify that a pipeline has to use this template to be able to use this credential. So we add that in for you by default. You can choose not to do this if you want to as well. So this is what the pipeline looks like basically. So it's just doing standard Terraform stuff in this case. So init and plan and apply further down here. So we actually have two stages. So it does a plan stage and then it does a apply stage. And the reason we do that is that the apply environment has the approval on it. So it'll prompt for approval before it does that apply. So over in Azure, I'll show you what it deployed in here. So if we go to the bootstrap, so I use the 4 subscription model for this. So I've got a separate bootstrap subscription. You'll see I've got a few resource groups in here, so apologies for not being easy to see. I'm just going to filter it down. I just deployed everything today in case I got asked any questions. So that's why I've got deployed every different option basically. That's why it's busy. But basically it's these 4 resource groups that got deployed earlier. So I've got agents, identity, network, and state. So the identity, I'll just have a look at that. So I've got a separate plan and apply. If you remember, the plan only has read-only access to my subscriptions and management groups, and the apply has read-write access, so that somebody doing a pull request wouldn't be able to do something like change something, whereas somebody doing the apply after the approval would be able to change something. So if we look in the apply, you can see we've got federated credentials here. So I'm not going to go into too much depth in this, but if you're familiar with OpenID Connect and Workload Identity Federation in Azure, you can see that we've got a subject here. The bit that you might not be familiar with, this is this job workflow ref. This is where we specify the template file that has to be used for that workflow. So if somebody tries to change the pipeline and specify a different file, it won't let them do that. It won't let them use this credential in that scenario. So just nip back over here. So you can see we've got some networking here. So we've got some private endpoints for container registry and for the storage account. We've also got a NAT gateway for the container instances here so that they work consistently with their outbound access. The agents themselves are in here. So we've got 2 container instances for redundancy. And we've got the container register, which contains the container image. So we don't have a public container image for this. It builds it as part of the deployment and puts it in this registry for you. And you can choose to use your own image if you want to. There's inputs that you can change to achieve that. But so that we don't have to support a public container image, we have a Docker file which gets built and put into this registry as part of this deployment. The last bit is the storage account. So because this is a Terraform one, we've got a storage account as well. And this storage account has private networking and it's got a container. So the user assigned managed identities have got access to this container, but nothing else does. So they've just got storage blob data owner on this container. This is because I was debugging earlier, sorry. They wouldn't normally have my account there, so just ignore that. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of what gets deployed as the bootstrap with GitHub in that case. I then triggered the pipeline and it deployed the landing zone. So when I first set it up, I just had a management group that I added here, and I just had my free subscriptions underneath it. So when I deployed the accelerator, it built me my management group structure. So I've got the management groups that you might be familiar with. On this management group, we've got the policy definitions and we've got the policy assignments at different layers of the management group structure. You can see that it's moved my subscriptions under the relevant management group down here as well. So I'm just going to quickly look in the management subscription. And you can see here that I've got my management resources. So my log analytics workspace and my automation account are in here, along with the data collection rules that are used for various bits. And then probably the more interesting bit is connectivity. So we've got this was deployed with the hub and spoke VNet option. So we've got virtual networks in UK South and UK West. We've got firewalls. We've got virtual network gateways for ExpressRoute and VPN deployed in here as well. And then we've got DNS zones. So these are attached to those virtual networks. And then we've got DDoS protection plan as well. So it's deployed all of those as part of that landing zone by default. And like I said, it's deployed that into multiple regions as well. So if we go back to you can see that that has now finished deploying. So if we go into Azure DevOps, we should now have another project. So I called it ALZ AD. That's what I called it in my configuration for ALZ Azure DevOps. So if we look in here, we're going to have a couple of repositories. So we've got management and we've got templates. So very similar. We use the same patterns for GitHub and Azure DevOps. So we've got the management repository and the templates repository. We've got a whole bunch of configuration in here. So one thing I didn't show you in GitHub was the agents, but if we go in here, we can see that we've got an agent pool. This one here, and we can see that we've got 2 agents. So these agents have just been spun up and attached to this pool just now. We've also got our service connections. So we've got the apply and the plan service connections. If you look at the apply service connections, it's also got the approval on it. So this is where we do the approval in Azure DevOps. So it's got this group that's been created, who's the approver for this. You also see that we've created 2 pipelines as well. So continuous integration, continuous delivery. So I'm going to kick off the continuous delivery pipeline. With both Azure DevOps and GitHub, we have an apply or a destroy option. So if you're just doing this to try it out and you want to clean it up afterwards, you can use a destroy option to clean it up afterwards. Obviously, probably in the real world, you wouldn't be running that destroy unless you want to destroy everything in your landing zone. But we do have that option there. So I'm going to run the apply now. So first of all, it's going to do a plan, and then it's going to spit out the plan for me to have a look at, and then it's going to prompt me for approval to do the apply here. So we're not going to have time to do this whole deployment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip back to the slides now and then just finish the last couple of slides, and then we can get some questions if we've still got a bit of time. Apologies that I'm going so fast. I'm just trying to fit everything in, so sorry about that.
No, going fine, buddy, going fine.
Okay. Great, where are we? Sorry, I should have gone back to the same slide. Okay, so we were here, so I'm going to move on to what's coming next. Okay. So if you're familiar with Azure Landing Zones, you've been on our community calls, we've been talking about ALZ vNext modules. So what I just showed you now is using the CAF Enterprise Scale module, which is our existing module, and it's using that to deploy the management groups and the management resources. We're actually using our AVM modules to deploy the connectivity. So everything that you saw networking-wise there was deployed with Azure Verified modules. We're going to implement the AVM module for management groups and management resources into that module that I just showed you. And that's imminent because we're almost ready to do that. We've got some documentation to do around it. But we are going to put that in there. So that's what's coming next. So you'll see that going forward, when you use this, it's going to use all Azure Verified modules for everything that you deploy in the platform landing zone. Similar with Bicep, we're going to, and Jack and the team will be able to tell you more about this on a separate call probably, but they're refactoring Bicep to use Azure Verified modules as well for the Azure Landing Zone. So again, once that's ready, that's going to come in here as well. Sovereign landing zones. So this was released just last week, so you may probably not familiar with it, but if you look in our starter module options, you'll see an option for sovereign landing zones now. So this is to support customers that need to have all their resources in one location, one geographical location, and there's a whole bunch of policies and stuff that are applied around that to make sure that that happens, and is always the case. So this will probably get publicly announced soon because it's already available if you want to look at it. Then the last bit, so right at the start I mentioned we've got platform landing zones, which is what we've gone through today, but there's also application landing zones. So what do you can deploy this platform landing zone, but then what next? What do you do? How do you vend subscriptions? How do you connect those subscriptions into your hub networking? How do you bootstrap your CI/CD and repositories for those applications that you want to deploy into Azure? So that's what we're looking at tackling next with the application landing zones. So we're going to extend what we've done with the accelerator, basically to add another pipeline, which will be a reusable pipeline with some parameters that you can then use to deploy an application landing zone. And it'll be optional about whether you use an existing subscription or create a new subscription, whether you use agents in a central pool or you have agents per workload. Like, we're going to provide options around that, and how you structure your subscriptions and resource groups as well. We're going to allow some flexibility there. We're going to have to be a bit opinionated because we can't do everything for everybody, but we're going to try and be flexible, but give you a way to get to the next stage of how do I actually deploy a workload into Azure, and how do I do it in a secure way, in a standard way. That's what's coming next. So we're working on that next after we get the ALZ AVM module out. So last slide. How can you help? We want you to help. We want you to look at what we've done with the accelerators. We want you to raise issues. We want you to raise pull requests. We want feedback. We want you to tell us what we can improve. Yeah, so try them out.
Thanks for watching this video. It has been created from an internal session that we felt was valuable content to share with our wider community and audiences. Please do try out the ALZ Accelerators and log any issues or feature requests on the GitHub repo shown on screen now at aka.ms/ALZ/accelerator.